Welcome to today's webinar, Coaching and Education, a Cornerstone for School Improvement. My name is Stephanie Gerard, and I am the Manager of Education, Research, and Marketing at the Institute of Coaching. And we are so grateful to have three international leaders in the field of coaching and education with us today. Dr. Jim Knight is President of Instructional Coaching Group in Kansas. Dr. Christian van Nieuwerburgh is Senior Lecturer, Coaching Psychology at University of East London. And John Campbell is Managing Director of Growth Coaching International in Sydney, Australia. I'm confident that you are as equally impressed by their experience in the field, and I am most certain that we will gain tremendous insight from today's webinar. Before passing it over to our experts, I will cover just a few logistical details while folks continue to sign in. All attendee audio has been muted to avoid any background noise, as we're expecting a large group, over 100 participants today. However, we do welcome your questions during the webinar. Please feel free to send them to us via the webinar question function. John, Jim, and Christian will try their best to answer as many questions throughout the webinar as time allows. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available in the library section of the ICPA member site within 2 weeks. And there will be a survey following, and we'd appreciate it if everyone would provide their feedback. So without any further ado, I am so excited to pass it over to Mr. John Campbell.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the call. It's great to have the chance to talk with you today about the kind of things we've been experiencing in the whole field of coaching and education these last few years. Just a little bit more background on each of us. My coaching practice, Growth Coaching International, works exclusively in the school education sector in Australia in coaching and coaching training services. With me today, Jim Knight, as you've heard, is also the Director of the Kansas Coaching Project here at the University of Kansas, and President of the Impact Research Lab. He's also written several key texts in the whole field of instructional coaching. Also with us today is Christian van Nieuwerburgh, who is Program Leader for the Masters in Coaching Psychology program at the University of East London, and has written a foundation work, Coaching and Education, that has been quite influential in the field. So across the next hour, we're planning to just structure the call around three broad questions, and we'll each speak to these and address the various issues that we see emerging in the field, share our experiences and the kind of practices that are making a difference. So initially, we'll look at what is coaching in education and just do some definitional work to clarify how it's playing out, and just looking at how in each of our three different geographical locations, we're seeing coaching and education take shape, emerge, and develop. And then we'll look at some specific contexts of the way coaching is working in schools through a concept of the portals that we've been exploring, some entry points, and conclude with some final summary comments. So that's the plan. We welcome your questions, as Stephanie has already indicated, and we'll look to get to as many of those as we can across the course of this next hour. So as we start then, what is coaching in education? And I'm going to ask Christian just to make some initial comments.
I'm really looking forward to sharing my thoughts with you. We're going to start by looking at a definition of coaching in education, which probably was the most challenging sentence that I had to write for this book, which you see at the bottom of the screen there, Coaching in Education, Getting Better Results for Students, Educators, and Parents. And this is the definition that we decided to go with. So as you see on the screen there, one of the key elements of coaching in education is the fact that it's a one-to-one conversation, and I think what's important here is that a one-to-one conversation ensures a dialogue between the coach and the coachee. And the really key element, what makes coaching in education different from coaching in other areas, is the focus on learning and development. As you'll see, I'm suggesting in this definition that coaching in education is very different from teaching. I'm kind of positioning it as coaching in an educational setting is all about facilitating the learning of others. And a really important thing, particularly today, as we start to think about how positive psychology can also influence coaching in education, it's very important to remember that we're thinking that a coaching conversation is, generally speaking, positive and supportive, although it may include challenge. So just to conclude, I think coaching in education is the same as any other type of coaching, but it's particularly about supporting self-directed learning.
The kind of work that you're doing in the field here is just worth exploring as well. So when we talk about coaching in education, how's that coming through for you?
Well, there's a lot of different ways of approaching coaching in education, and at the University of Kansas, what we've really focused on is a simple equation: better teaching equals better learning. And so how do we go about making that happen? Well, what we do is we follow a simple cycle. Now, I'm not going to go into the research except to say that it's been 5 years that we've spent using design research as our way of refining this cycle. And we've learned a lot working with teachers first off in Beaverton, Oregon, and then, coaches in Beaverton, Oregon, and then coaches in Othello, Washington. And through that work, we've done other studies as well to look at the impact, but through that work, we've landed on this process. And maybe if you look at those 3 cycles, identify, learn, improve, I could just sort of give you a story of how it might work. So let's say a teacher and a coach get together. Usually we would use video or look at student work, but often it's video. And the coach would go in and video record a teacher's classroom. And then the teacher would watch the video, and they'd come together and they'd have a series of questions we walk through to identify a goal that the teacher would like to work on. We think it's best for it to be a student-focused goal because that becomes a kind of objective standard of excellence. So a student-focused goal could be something about achievement. I want my students to get 5 out of 5 on a rubric for effective paragraphs. It could be something about behavior. I want no more than 2 disruptions every 10 minutes. Or it could be about attitude. I want my kids to read for pleasure. 90% of my kids will read for pleasure. So whatever it is, once we set a goal, we pick a strategy to help us hit the goal. So for example, let's say the teacher wanted to increase engagement. Maybe they decide to use cooperative learning, have the kids working together and learning together. Or maybe they want to change the nature of the assignments to make them more authentic. But to learn whatever that strategy is, we usually have precise checklists that describe the practice. Our work, we feel, has really been validated by Atul Gawande's work in the checklist manifesto. So we precisely describe the practice, and then the person sees it before they have to teach it. And that could mean watching a video or someone coming in their classroom to show them how the practice works, or going and watching another teacher, or some combination of those. But the person has a clear description, and they see it. And usually the clear description is described precisely, but we leave flexibility for the person to modify it if they want to. Then the improvement part is simply the teacher tries out the practice to see if they can hit the goal. And sometimes we hit the goal and we pick another goal, and sometimes we don't hit the goal and we go back and say, let's revisit the checklist. Do we need to change the way it was taught? Or did we pick the wrong teaching strategy? Should we try something else? And we keep going. And through this process, what we found is little changes have a big impact on student learning and student well-being. And we just follow that simple process of identifying a goal, learning a practice, and then implementing it and modifying and adjusting it until we hit the goal.
Great, thanks, Jim. And there's a specific focus you've been giving to the whole coaching approach in relation to teaching practice. And we'll hear a little bit more about that later as well. I guess in Australia, what we're seeing is that the term is being applied to broadly to describe how coaching skills, models, and values are changing, and I would say even transforming the range of conversations that take place across school communities in both formal ways and in informal ways. And we're seeing educators having embraced the whole notion of coaching conversations very warmly, very broadly, and it's making some significant changes in the way those school communities run and operate. So some differences there in how that's playing out, and maybe we'll go into those a little more specifically in our second question, because we're all located in quite different parts of the world and seeing some different things emerge and some similar things emerge. So in the US, Jim, which is primarily where you're based, how is it playing out for you here? What are the sorts of things that are really a key part of the whole coaching and education thing for you?
Well, coaching can happen in lots of different ways. Although the focus in the schools in America would be on it's going to have a positive impact on students' lives. Generally speaking, that's going to be the focus. And sometimes you'll have cognitive coaching, which is more like the kind of coaching where you set a goal with the person and you work from an assumption that through dialogue, through mediating their learning, you're going to lead the teacher to deeper insights into their assumptions, and when they're more aware of their assumptions, they'll change their practice. So we'll talk maybe a bit more about that later on. But there are many other kinds of coaching. Literacy coaches focus on literacy. Sometimes literacy coaches end up working with students and with teachers, although generally coaching is focused on teachers. There's leadership coaching where we work on leadership. There's data coaching where coaches help teachers on teams usually go through the data and assess what's working, what's not working, and make some adjustments. So coaching, broadly speaking, it's probably one of the most commonly used terms now when we talk about improvement in schools, and it comes up in lots of different ways. Our focus is on instruction, but there are lots of other ways as well.
And Christian, your experiences in the UK, and also increasingly some work in the Middle East as well. So your thoughts on how that's working there?
Yeah, I'd like to talk primarily about my experiences in England, because that's where I've been doing the most work. And first of all, I'd like to say I share Jim's point there about we're very concerned about creating better experiences for learners. So when we use the term coaching in education, ultimately what we're hoping for is that through the use of coaching approaches or strategies, ultimately the learner's experience is going to be enhanced within the classroom. So that's always the main focus. But in response to the question of how is it playing out in England, particularly since around the year 2005, there's been a lot of interest in coaching and education. And since then, it's become part of coaching training, has become part of the professional development of educational leaders. So people training to become school leaders, there tends to be some coaching training element within that. And supporting what Jim was saying, we're starting to use the word coaching quite frequently when we talk about school improvement more generally. So in addition to other school improvement strategies, coaching is often being used as something quite central to that. A more interesting thing from my point of view, I really love working in schools with teachers, with students sometimes. But there has been quite a lot of training teachers to become coaches, and that is so that they can both support one another, so peer coaching between teachers, but also start to use some of those coaching skills and approaches with their students as well. And a piece of research that we've been involved in at the University of East London is where the initial question, what we were curious about was what would be the impact of training students to become coaches? And this question arose because the Center for the Use of Research in Education, CURE, suggested that training teachers and school leaders to become coaches meant that they became better teachers and school leaders. And the research into coaching in organizations also supports this. So when managers are trained to become coaches, they become better in their management function. So with that context in the back of our minds, we undertook a piece of research where we trained students to become coaches, and then these trained student coaches coached younger students within the school. And our question was whether this training would lead the students to become better students. So we were kind of measuring their study skills. And the research actually did show that the students who we trained to become coaches reported that their study skills had improved. More importantly, the research also showed us that their emotional intelligence scores had increased, and the students were reporting a wide range of benefits in addition to those two factors. So there's a number of different ways that coaching is having an impact in schools all across the United Kingdom. And I would say at the moment the interest is about creating coaching cultures for learning. So quite a lot of interest there now, where schools are saying, you know what, we've got a couple of initiatives, we're doing some coaching, some of our staff have been trained, but how can we create a coaching culture within our school? So I guess that's it in a nutshell, John.
What about a Middle East experience? Anything there to comment on that is interesting to know?
Yeah, there's been an increased interest from the Middle East, and I particularly work in the United Arab Emirates. And out there, a number of schools have started thinking about how they can introduce coaching into their school environments. I'm going to be saying a little bit more about the different ways that that can be done a little bit later in this conversation. It might be worth noting at this point that through our sister organization called Growth Coaching Online, we have developed an online course which kind of talks about the different ways that coaching can be used within educational settings. And I think in the Middle East at the moment, we're at quite an early stage of looking at how coaching can have an impact within schools, colleges, and universities.
And from an Australian perspective, just to add my thoughts on that, we've seen considerable, extraordinary perhaps growth in this whole area in the last decade. Initially the focus, I think from our perspective, was at the leadership level, and the ideas about coaching had come across from the corporate world and executive coaching, leadership coaching, and school leaders embraced that. Once they'd had an experience of coaching directly themselves, they were often interested in exploring how they might work in that way with their own staff. And so once we had individual leadership coaching for school leaders, and some systems in Australia have very extensively supported that, provided funding to enable school principals to receive 10 coaching sessions across a year. Quite an extraordinary commitment, and the state government in Victoria has been doing that kind of thing for some time. And then more recently, leaders coach type training school leaders to operate in a coaching way, in the way that they interact with their staff, has been very prominent, and educators have really embraced that as a style of leading that they can really relate to, that has had immediate impact in the way that they've worked and related with their school executive teams and others. And it's been interesting to note from my experience, because of spent quite a lot of time in the corporate world. I had an education background, then worked in leadership development in the corporate world for a while, and started my coaching work in the corporate world, and have, in the last decade, spent more time back in the education environment. And from my perspective, this is only one person here, but there's been a much more warm embrace of the whole coaching approach in the education world. As I think for many reasons, it's something that reminds educators of some of the kinds of principles and approaches that were part of what drew them into teaching in the first place. So I think there have been some differences there that I've been able to notice. But more recently, what we're seeing is a huge interest in coaching as an approach to assist in the enhancement of teaching practice, which Jim has spoken of earlier. Much more focus on how we work with teachers to help them get better at what they do. How do we observe them teaching? How do we have conversations with them about that observed data we might have collected as we've watched teaching happen? And great strides, and some quite considerable cultural changes that have been overcome or are in the process of being overcome, as teachers have often lived in isolated worlds. Close the door of my classroom, what happens here is my territory, and there's been some quite significant steps to help deprivatize the teaching process and invite others in and work with coaches or peers using a coaching process to really hone in on setting goals around teaching practice and seeing the benefits that have flowed from that. That's been a significant development in Australia. And more recently, I would say just in the last few months even, a final point from me here is we're starting to see whole systems start to embrace a coaching approach. As Christian indicated, some schools perhaps have dabbled a little in the coach training, have done a little bit of coaching in one way or another, are now saying, we'd like to have a 3-year plan about how we do this. We'd like to see where this could take us across the next period of time, and what other contexts could we use coaching and coaching approaches. And so these kind of system questions are being raised about coaching culture and what's that going to do for us, and how might that be something that we can embrace and move towards in a more extended way. So from 8 or 9 years ago, being called in, invited in to run a professional learning workshop that involves some kind of coaching skills, we're now having questions about, can you come and talk to us about how we might embrace a coaching culture here? What might that look like? And how can we begin to take steps towards it, which I think is a considerable development that we're experiencing in Australia, and I'm seeing that echoed in the UK and also in the US as we've talked with colleagues here. So a number of different ways we're seeing the geography make a little bit of a difference, but some very common themes emerging as well. So this point that some questions would be good to have, and I'm seeing a few coming through here. Is the book out? There's one question, and so just looking at the questions here, we might just take a moment to consider some of those. There are a few there. Would you like to respond to that, Jim?
Well, the question is, in his book, Out of Our Minds, Ken Robinson reports that global business and public sector leaders agree overwhelmingly that the single most important leadership competency for organizations in the 21st century is creativity. Tony Wagner echoes the same sentence in his book, Creating Innovators. Based on your expertise and experience, would you recommend any effective youth coaching models or a set of mentoring techniques that foster creativity in young people? In your opinion, how do they differ from other life coaching or mentoring models? Paul Tuff, Angela D. Duckworth, and others argue that non-cognitive skills like grit, resilience, perseverance, and optimism are far more important than IQ. This is a little thesis we've got here. Is that the same question, I wonder? Yeah, same person. So do you want to reply to the first one, or do you want me to reply? Well, I think that when we do instructional coaching, our focus is on whatever the goal of the teacher is with respect to improvement. And so if the teacher sets the goal around creativity, then we would look at whatever particular teaching practices might help us hit that goal. We'd have to figure out how do we know whether or not the kids are having more, are being more creative. We might have self-report on the part of the kids. We might observe it in certain ways. We might look at their work. But first off, we'd set a goal, and then we would do our best to hit the goal. But instructional coaching, the focus is not on the students per se. The focus is on how can we improve teaching through better instruction. Now, other forms of coaching, and I think Christian can speak to this, might accomplish that through having the students learn how to coach themselves, and they could look at things like creativity. Well, I'll let Christian take that one right now.
So I'll follow on from that. In the research that I mentioned when we've trained young people to become coaches, I do think that kind of training can significantly increase their ability to think laterally. One of the kind of insights that some of these young people had was that it's okay not to have a correct answer, for example. And to answer the question, how is the training different? It isn't significantly different. I think the important thing in the research we did was that the young people received high quality coach training. And when it came time to thinking about study skills or how to perform better at school, we very much invited the students to bring some of their own insights into those conversations. And the quantitative, and it was a mixed method study that we undertook, so we did have some qualitative discussions with students. And one of the interesting things for me is that quite a few of the students identified that the coaching-related skills that they picked up are lifelong skills, and they were able to see that those skills would help them as they went out after school, either to university or to look for a job or whatever it was. So I do think that one of the key things that we want to do for our young people is to make them more independent, more creative, and part of that involves them taking some more responsibility for themselves. And training them to be coaches, I think, is a really powerful way of doing that.
At all. I think I agree with Atul Gawande's quote that coaching, and I might not have it exactly, I'm just doing it from my head, but coaching done well is perhaps the most effective way to improve human performance. And so the question then is, how is coaching done well? And I think coaching done poorly is not a good use of expenses, but there's a paper, a master's thesis, David Knight is the author, on the cost effectiveness of coaching. You could just Google that to find a study on that. But if you're setting goals and hitting the goals, and you're recording the data and showing the data, you should be able to see pretty quickly that if you want change, you're going to have someone who makes it happen. And I get the economic constraints in U.S. schools, but when people start cutting athletic coaches before they cut out instructional coaches, I'll say the issue isn't a priority issue. So long as you're cutting funds in other areas, or cutting the instructional coaches before other areas, the issue really isn't about budget. The issue is about priorities. And if your priority is to improve the school, you need to be showing unmistakable improvements in your professional development. So I think you can measure the cost effectiveness of it by looking at how long it takes to get there, and we've done that with our work. But the bottom line is not about the budget. Sure, we need more money. We need teachers to have more planning time. There are many ways in which to coach it. The budgets are under-preparing our schools. But coaching, if it's a priority, they'll do it. I'll just give one little anecdote. I know we're watching the clock here, but in Bozeman, Montana, someone in the community donated something like $700,000 to the school district for coaching. Actually, they said, use it however you like, and the district decided to hire coaches. So they spent 3 years using those funds for coaching. At the end of 3 years, the funds were gone. And they said, well, we can't really afford coaching anymore. And the principal said, no, we have to have coaching. Those people are integral to improvement. The principal sat down with the board and the superintendent, and they said, how can we find funds so we can keep coaching? And they actually found enough money when they analyzed the budget carefully that they added coaches in the schools to make sure every school had a coach. So the money is there if you make it the top priority.
Just to comment from the Australian perspective on that as well, I agree, Jim. There's been a sense in which the prioritisation of coaching has been quite interesting to see. And yes, budgets are tight. But what's been true for our experience is something that you just mentioned there. Once people have had an experience of how the coaching process can make a difference, even though they may not have necessarily tied it up with lots of research and data, they are able to find different ways of going about it, to collaborate with other schools, to prioritize above other areas and so on. So whilst it is a challenge, people have got quite creative in the way they've responded to that because they've seen it have such impact. So interesting question. Thank you for asking that one. We'll move along to the third item on our agenda here at this point, and perhaps then come back to questions that we might have still some time for at the end. But our third question was just to get more specific about this concept of the coaching portals or entry points through which coaching may work in schools. Christian, you'd like to speak to this?
Yeah, I would like to speak to it. I think this is a really important framework framework that we're developing. It's still, in process, as it were. There's two main reasons for this. One is a selfish personal reason that we came up with, or I was interested in coming up with this, and the other is a more legitimate reason. The first selfish reason is that when I said to people, look, I'm working in this area called coaching and education, nobody knew what I was talking about. They were saying, well, what do you mean? Do you coach students? Are you coaching teachers? Is it about training people to become coaches? Are you an executive coach for school leaders? So part of that short-sighted selfish reason was I wanted to be able to say, no, there's all these different ways. But a more legitimate reason, I guess, both academically and from practice, is that for academically, we just wanted to be able to set out all the different ways that coaching may have an impact in educational settings. And this has been helpful because we're able to identify now that some areas have been supported better by research than others. So this could form a research agenda where we could say, well, look, these areas we're getting some research in, other areas we haven't got research. But perhaps more importantly, the idea of the portals can be used for practitioners. And what we mean by that is that if there are educators or professionals interested in using coaching in schools, colleges, or universities, this gives them an idea of the different entry points, and that's a phrase that John just used. So what are the different ways in which we can start to have an impact on what's important? And what is important, we're saying, is that we have better learning experiences for students. So remember, I'm saying this may change, but at the moment we feel that there's these four main areas where attention can be focused, and we're calling them portals or entry points because we believe that you can open any one of these doors and start having an impact within educational settings. So the first one is student success and well-being, and within this portal there'd be a range of other sub-portals, but broadly speaking these are interventions which focus on how can we help students to be more successful or to be well. And for example, that could be teachers coaching students. It could be training students to become coaches. It could be students coaching one another. So those are a few examples of what would be behind that portal. Then the other one, and this is where it's such a privilege to work with Jim and John on this, the idea of actually saying that how can we use coaching to enhance teaching practice? The idea that better teaching will lead to better learning, therefore, and there is some good research to back that claim. So how would we do that? Teaching practice, well, instructional coaching is key within that portal. But I guess other ways of improving teaching practice through coaching is the idea of using lesson study. That's a process that was developed in Japan. Maybe peer coaching between teachers, teachers observing one another. So here's a whole other portal which could be opened and which could have a significant impact within educational settings by focusing on how can we help teachers to improve their coaching practice. Now the third one I'm going to go to is educational leadership. And what we're talking about here is how can coaching be used to make sure that you've got good leadership within schools. Because some people would argue that the quality of leadership within an educational organization is a key factor when it comes to the things we're interested in, i.e. Student success and well-being. So how would that look? Well, coaching for educational leadership could include executive coaching for school leaders, like John has suggested is already happening in Victoria and Australia. It's been happening in the United Kingdom as well. So school leaders have had access to coaches and mentors to help them to be better educational leaders, I guess. But another way that coaching could have a positive impact within this space is for school leaders to coach others and maybe also use a coaching approach in their interactions with others. So a lot of potentially different ways behind this portal that would make a significant impact to the learning environment. One thing that the research is kind of suggesting at the moment is that in our interest to develop coaching cultures, an essential foundational element is that the school leadership team or the educational leaders within an organization are fully behind such an initiative. So another important portal. And I would say that currently the research supports the teaching practice portal quite significantly, and it also supports the educational leadership arena as well. There has been some research into that, less so around the student success and well-being. And perhaps at the moment, least of all, is the third one, which we sometimes call parental involvement and sometimes we call community involvement. And that is the area where we're thinking about how can we provide either coaching skills to people within the community, or how can we coach parents and other people within the community to support their learners. So that's a very brief kind of overview of the 4 portals. And as I say, we're still working on this and developing it, and it's a great pleasure to work with Jim and John on doing that. And I think we learn so much by looking at what works well in different parts of the world. And this portals concept has allowed us to bring all of those things together and just make sure that, you know, we're working on an evidence base and we're using the best practice wherever we can find it. And my final point here is I think this respects the professionalism of the people that we work with. Because what I like to do when I go to a school that's interested in coaching approaches is to say to them, look, here's a number of different portals. Which is the one that's most important to you? Or which is the area that you're working on already? Giving a lot more choice to schools to say, you know, we want to start with student success and well-being, for example, or educational leadership, or teaching practice, or community involvement. And that's a really great way to start with where the school is already. So that's a little overview of the portals concept and how we're seeing it working and how it brings together a lot of the excellent work that's going on in different parts of the world.
Yes, from my point of view, the portals perspective here, the framework, really highlights a systems view of schools and the whole relational context, the whole relational experiences that make a school work, so that at every point on this portals framework, there's some kind of interaction, there's some kind of conversation taking place. And we think that there's a role for coaching approaches and coaching to inform the way those different interactions occur. And it's the sum total of these, and they'll all be different in different school contexts, different school experiences. But the sum total of these, that starts to move towards the coaching culture concept. And it's refreshing to see people take a more broader, holistic view about how this whole approach can work. And it's that sort of thing that we're seeing is leading to the broader school improvement results that are flowing from it. Jim, your thoughts here on how this is playing out?
I just think it's really a helpful framework to look at coaching in lots of different perspectives, although our focus has been teaching practice. We are looking at how can we help parents become coaches and start to do similar kind of research there. Students learning the coaching model, I think, is really powerful. At coaching are life skills. It's not just about them getting better, helping someone else get better, but in the act of coaching they learn a great deal. And there's no question that educational leadership will have an impact on kids' lives. I think if you look back at the model, I'll put it back up there again for a second. When we look at these different portals to coaching, that I think the question then becomes, well, what's the coaching look like? And so we found this diagram, and there's various versions of this diagram out there. But as I started to think about how you do coaching, this model helped me sort of position how the coaching could take place. And so one model of coaching might be where an expert tells a novice how to do whatever it is they're coaching the person on. So in athletics, for example, an athletic coach might say, if you want to play on this team, this is the way we do it. I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to monitor. I'm going to make sure you do it. And in education, early on, in America at least, there were coaching models, but that's essentially it. I'm a fidelity coach. I'm to make sure you do it the right way. Well, the literature on the experience, on the personal experience of change, and the literature on helping would say that is problematic if you just tell the person what to do, because as Eric Louis has said and others have said, when you insist, they will resist. So other approaches to coaching really position the coach as a partner, as a peer, and they say that through listening, through dialogue, through questioning, you can help the person understand answers to their problems that they don't even realize that they have. You essentially, through focused strategic questions, you help people solve their issues, set goals, and move forward. In that model of coaching, you would never share any expertise. If you did that, it wouldn't be considered coaching. If you move away from just being a partner with the person to giving advice, you move into the role of being an expert, and they would say that's consulting, not coaching. Sometimes coaching focuses on, usually when you're in the peer approach to coaching, on just asking questions, listening carefully, and provoking the person to think deeply. We consider coaching a way of mediating thinking, but not so much telling the other person what to do. In the instructional coaching model and in some expert models, what coaches do is they tell people, after the person has set a goal, instructional coaching, after the person has set a goal and picked a strategy, we help them learn the strategy. So instructional coaching as a model is kind of in all four corners. We set a goal with the teacher. The teacher is the decision maker. They look at video to get a clear picture of current reality. But then we have practices to share that would help the person move forward. We ask questions to set goals, but we describe the practice once they identify the one they want to implement. But I think whatever the form of coaching is, you have to sort of position yourself here, take into account the personal experience of change, and say what kind of coaching is going to be most helpful.
Thanks, Jim. We're getting towards the end of our time, and we think it might be just useful to bring some final summary comments and then see whether there's a couple of questions we might want to respond to before we totally finish. So in terms of summarizing some thoughts on this area, Christian, what would be some things you'd like to bring to that?
Summarizing, I think we're at a very exciting place within the field of coaching in education. Starting to get a better idea of how it's going to make a difference, starting to get some real strong evidence about the effectiveness of different types of coaching. And, you know, this interest in the idea of creating a coaching culture within schools is something that for me is kind of very exciting. And I've been to some schools where I think, you know, I can see a coaching culture in place already. So one of my key kind of takeaway messages from those kinds of experiences, and having done a bit of research into coaching cultures myself, is that you know, what's really powerful is a dual focus on student success and well-being on the one hand, and educator well-being on the other. And I think where I've been into an educational organization where I've thought, you know, this feels like a coaching culture to me, what's very noticeable is that both students and staff are feeling valued. So I think there's something there for me.
Jim, some summary comments.
Well, I would say two things. One of them is we really believe that there should be unmistakable, significant improvement in kids' lives as a result of instructional coaching, what we study. If you don't see a change in what's happening with kids, then in my opinion, the coaching hasn't been successful. And the second thing is we found, and there's a paper about this on the instructionalcoach.org website, we found that when you position the teacher as a partner, as a professional, capable of making decisions for themselves, it's going to be a lot more effective than when you move into, I'm just going to tell you what to do and you need to do it, kind of a top-down approach. The trouble with the top-down approach is it doesn't usually lead to much change. And so, but we found when you treat teachers as professionals, meaning that they're people capable of making decisions for themselves, and instead of telling the person what to do as a coach, what you're doing is you're helping them accomplish their goals, that you get a lot more impact. We call that the partnership approach, and we think positioning yourself as a partner is a really important part of successful coaching. Now, if you want to follow up and get more information, we do. Our website is impactresearchlab.com. It's only been up for a week, so we've sort of expanded our scope beyond just coaching to looking at teaching practices and other ideas.
And from our point of view, John and I are working on this Growth Coaching Online. We're setting up an online course on coaching and education, which covers all of these things. And we're quite keen to support, like Jim, we're quite keen to support evidence-based coaching practices in schools.
Yes, final comments from me, and we'll just review a few questions and come back to conclude those. When we've seen teachers get to understand the coaching process and develop some skills and some tools, we've seen them do amazing things with coaching in a whole range of these contexts that we've been exploring. So we think it's a very exciting time in terms of how coaching is working in the education field. We need to keep the research going in terms of the difference it's making. We need to always keep the outcomes for students in mind. Otherwise, it can just be adults in the system talking to each other. So all of those things are starting to happen, though, in each of the 3 locations in which we're working, and also in some of the work we're doing in Asia, we're seeing these things emerge, and we're encouraged by the science and the response that we're getting. So just as we conclude, some further questions we've just noticed that would be happy to respond to. So Jim?
Just to say, there was one question earlier about a paper for the improvement cycle or writing around the improvement cycle, and I've submitted a paper to Journal of Staff Development. They have a journal coming out February 2015, and I haven't heard officially that they're going to publish it, but I'm unofficially optimistic that it'll be published there. So that's a place to read that. There's a question in your coaching experience if you described if there's any variability in teachers who choose to engage in coaching and teachers who are referred to coaching. We would draw on the research about helping and adults learning, and for example, Prochaska's work, what Edgar Shine talks about, DC and Ryan's work. I put that all together, and what we found is if you tell a person they have to do something, to put it in simple terms, it's often going to engender resistance up front. So we suggest that a principal who refers someone to coaching is firm on this standard but flexible on how to get there. So they say, I was in your classroom, this is what I observed, you need to improve in these areas. How you do it is up to you. I don't care if you use your Ouija board to do it, but what has to happen is you have to move forward. And you may want to work with the coach. She's a pro at engagement. She could be really helpful, but it's really your call. I don't care how you do it, but I'm going to keep coming back, I'm going to check, and the change has to happen. We think it's a really poor use of resources to spend your time coaching, trying to talk someone into being coached. So we want to work with people who are volunteers who want to work with us. It's not to let people off in terms of improvement. If the principal has to make a judgment, has to have a difficult conversation, but they should respect the professionalism of the teacher and give them the option of improving in whatever way that works best for them. And if coaching isn't it, they probably shouldn't have a coach. They should do it in another way.
Thanks, Jim. I'd like to just add that, and this is just based on my own experiences. I've had the privilege of coaching teachers and school leaders, and I think choice is an essential element in coaching. So I think that's a great question. Where possible, I encourage there to be as much choice built in as possible. In the training, the research I mentioned, where we trained students to become coaches, we insisted that this was a voluntary kind of activity. We said to all of the students, any of you that want to can become coaches. So I think, choice is one of the essential principles that underpins coaching. Having said that, if it's not there, it may still be possible to do some coaching, but you have to put in a lot of extra work to build that relationship. And I think it can harm the reputation of coaching within the school. I think it's very important that coaching is not seen to be remedial, so that coaching is for people who are performing well and want to perform better. So for all of those reasons, I think where possible, we're looking to have choice for our clients.
There's a question here. Could you please address how coaching adults supports the efficacy of the coachee? I'm thinking more of using a strength-based coaching approach instead of a deficit-based model, which focuses more on specific improvements, such as solving problems, improving low achievement, etc. Do you want to start there, or do you want me to start?
I can make some comments on that initially. The sorts of things here in terms of positive psychology, appreciative inquiry, solution-focused approaches that I'm fairly loosely wrapping up together there, and that's perhaps not that helpful. But the positive strength-based approaches certainly are a key philosophical underpinning to the way we approach the whole coaching process that we work in schools. And we've found that that's been very warmly welcomed. And so we also, in relation to perhaps the other question that was asked too, in terms of positioning coaching, we have tended to work with folks who are strong teachers and encourage people to start with successful practitioners, and rather than position coaching as a remedial practice. We haven't found that particularly helpful at all. So yes, we do see a strong place for the various sort of positive psychology, strengths-based principles underpinning the way the whole growth coaching approach goes as well, and I know Jim supports that too.
Well, I would just say that we describe what we do as reality-based coaching, which means, for all intents and purposes, we take a strengths-based approach because people are quick to go negative in terms of observation and judgment, and we really think you have to be attentive to what's going well. But if things aren't going well and there are real problems in the classroom, we think they have to be surfaced and addressed. So sometimes what happens, and we use video, a teacher watches a video of the class and they say, you know, I noticed in this part of the class it was working really well. How can we do more of that? The teacher will look at the class and they'll say, I was disappointed by the level of engagement and we need to address that. Either way, we do believe that coaching is not about fixing weak people. It's about getting great at whatever you do. We work from assumption that most people don't feel fulfilled unless they're striving to get better. But we also don't hide from unpleasant reality when the unpleasant reality has to be addressed. The tendency is to go negative, and we want to go positive, but at the same time we do it with a clear picture on current reality. And what we found, what builds well-being for the coachee, is setting and hitting goals. That's the heart of what we do.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. I think there's probably time for one more question, and this is one that really connects with me, so I'm Christian. Do you recommend a certain training to develop coaching skills in educators? I have been thinking a lot about this question, and the way that we see what is behind effective coaching, we see three elements behind effective coaching. And one of those elements is a set of skills, coaching-related skills. The other element is to have a process. The process that we use is the growth process. And finally, we talk about a way of being, a particular way of being. And I think the great thing when you're working in education is that way of being already exists, and many of the skills already exist. So to answer your question, I tried to write a book that answered this question, and it's called An Introduction to Coaching Skills, a Practical Guide. And I wrote it specifically for people wanting to learn how to become coaches. And the book itself is supported by a companion website, a mobile study app, and up to 70 video clips. So that's definitely what I would recommend.
That's perhaps a good point for us to finish on. Yeah,
I'll make a quick answer.
One more question.
Well, just to respond to the question, we see 7 things as critical for a successful instructional coach. Now, instructional coaching is focusing on improving teaching to improve learning. But if that's the kind of coaching you're taking, you need to understand how to work with adults. You need to have a coaching cycle like the one I described, or some other kind of model for coaching. You need to have an understanding of effective teaching and what those practices look like. Communication skills, leadership skills. You need to have data on how to monitor progress towards the goal, and your system needs to support you. And on instructionalcoaching.com, we have a listing of workshops, and we address all those things through our workshops. So I would recommend what we do, but if you can't do it, if you're focused on instructional coaching, what Christian and John didn't mention is that they have an online course at Growth Coaching Online, and if you go there, you could take that course. And if you want a broader perspective on coaching, not one focused on instructional coaching, that's where I would go.
So thanks, folks. It's time to conclude where our time is out, and I just want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your questions. Some we haven't been able to get to. and also thank Jim and Christian for being part of this call. There are places where you can go to find further information. Some of those we've referred to in the course of this conversation. And I think in the masterclass resource material that supports this, references and websites and links that you could access to explore these things further. Of course, more than happy to take emails and so on. I think we've provided those here. We might have a way of doing that with Stephanie later on, perhaps. So I just want to say thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of what's happened here, and we look forward to perhaps some continuing conversation around this topic. There's none more vital, really, in terms of how coaching can be applied and how it can play out in education, and we're excited by what we're seeing there. So thanks for joining us today.
Yes, and I'd just like to add, thank you, John, Jim, and Christian. Wow, what a rich and insightful session. I know I learned so much in this past hour, and I am sure the rest of the participants agree as the questions keep storming in. I'd like to reiterate, John, you're right, that we do have a masterclass, and we will be launching that on our website within the next few days. And so it's a great resource for all of our members to delve a little bit deeper and it will reiterate everything that we've learned here today. And we'll make sure that we have all of your information online so that folks can reach out to you with the questions that may not have been answered today. So again, thank you so much for your time. This was a wonderful experience. I wish everyone a happy Halloween and a great weekend, and I look forward to continuing our learning together.